The pristine blue water of Karen Whitmore's meticulously maintained pool suddenly erupted in chaos as a golden retriever belly flopped directly into the deep end, followed immediately by the horrified shriek of its owner, Mrs. Chen from next door. Karen's organic kale smoothie went flying from her manicured hands, splattering green across her newly installed Italian travertine deck like abstract art gone wrong. But the third shock came when she spotted the unmistakable burgundy blazer of HOA President Margaret Sullivan marching through her back gate, clipboard in hand and fire in her eyes. "What in the name of Willow Creek Estates is going on here?" Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. Karen's perfectly coiffed blonde hair whipped around as she spun to face the tribunal of doom. Mrs. Chen was frantically trying to coax her soaking wet dog out of the pool while apologizing in rapid-fire bursts. But Karen's attention was laser-focused on Margaret's clipboard. That clipboard meant only one thing: violations. "Margaret, I can explain," Karen began, but Margaret's raised hand silenced her faster than a judge's gavel. "Karen Elizabeth Whitmore, in your capacity as HOA compliance officer, you are well aware that Section 4.7 of our community guidelines explicitly prohibits animals in residential swimming pools." Margaret's voice dripped with the authority of someone who'd memorized every bylaw since 1987. The irony wasn't lost on Karen. She'd spent 3 years terrorizing neighbors over fence heights, mailbox colors, and lawn ornament violations. Now she stood accused of the very infractions she'd built her reputation on exposing. Her mind raced through possible defenses, but Mrs. Chen's continued apologizing was making things worse by the second. "It's not my dog," Karen protested, pointing at the golden retriever now shaking pool water all over her deck furniture. "But it's your pool, and you're responsible for what happens on your property," Margaret countered, scribbling furiously. "I'm also noting the spillage on your deck, which violates the cleanliness standards outlined in Section 2.3. Karen felt her world tilting off its axis. Her position as compliance officer wasn't just a role. It was her identity, her purpose, her claim to fame in Willow Creek Estates. She'd earned respect through fear, admiration, through intimidation. Now that carefully constructed reputation was dissolving faster than chlorine tablets in her very own pool. "This is ridiculous," Karen snapped, her composure finally cracking like cheap nail polish. "I'll file a counter-complaint about Mrs. Chen's failure to control her pet." Margaret's eyebrows shot up with the intensity of someone who just discovered buried treasure. "Are you threatening retaliatory complaints, Karen? Because that would constitute a violation of Section 8.2, abuse of HOA procedures." The morning sun seemed to grow hotter as Karen realized she was trapped in a web of her own making, with the very rules she'd wielded as weapons now pointing directly at her throat. 3 hours later, Karen sat in her spotless kitchen, furiously typing on her laptop while ice cubes clinked in her stress relief wine glass. The emergency HOA board meeting she'd demanded was scheduled for that evening, and she intended to arrive armed with every procedural technicality in the book. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, Karen would show her what a real compliance expert looked like in action. But as she scrolled through the community guidelines, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach like spoiled milk. Every loophole she'd exploited to nail her neighbors could now be used against her. Every precedent she'd established for swift punishment was about to become her own executioner's axe. Her phone buzzed with a text from her alley-turned-enemy, HOA Secretary Janet Morrison. "Board meeting moved to Chen's backyard. 7 p.m. Bring your defense." Chen's backyard? The audacity was breathtaking. Karen's fingers trembled as she realized the political maneuvering happening behind the scenes. Her 3 years of iron-fisted rule had made her plenty of enemies, and they were circling like vultures at a roadside buffet. At exactly 7 p.m., Karen arrived at the Chen residence wearing her most authoritative navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed serious business. But the scene that greeted her was unlike any HOA meeting she'd ever attended. Neighbors who'd never spoken to each other were chatting like old friends, sharing snacks, and actually laughing. Mrs. Chen's golden retriever, now completely dry and wearing a ridiculous bow tie, was being treated like the guest of honor. "Karen, so glad you could make it," Margaret called out with artificial sweetness. "We were just discussing your situation." The word situation hung in the air like a bad smell. Karen straightened her shoulders and marched toward the makeshift podium someone had set up near the rose bushes. She'd faced hostile crowds before. Angry residents whose garden gnomes she'd banned, furious homeowners whose deck colors she deemed aggressively non-compliant. This would be no different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never lost a bureaucratic battle. "I stand before you today not as the accused, but as a victim of circumstance and selective enforcement." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but not the kind she'd expected. Several neighbors were smiling. Since when did HOA meetings involve smiling? "The incident this morning was clearly Mrs. Chen's responsibility," Karen continued, warming to her theme. "Pet control violations are outlined explicitly in—" "Actually, Karen," Mrs. Chen interrupted, stepping forward with a confidence that made Karen's blood pressure spike. "I need to clarify something about this morning." The golden retriever trotted over to Mrs. Chen, tail wagging like a metronome of impending doom. Karen watched in growing horror as Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be photos. "You see, Max here didn't just wander into your pool by accident," Mrs. Chen announced, holding up her phone for everyone to see. "These photos show the gate between our properties, the gate you installed 6 months ago without HOA approval." The crowd leaned in collectively, and Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. Her unauthorized gate, the one she'd convinced herself was too small to matter, was about to become her downfall. Margaret's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Karen, it appears we have more violations to discuss than we initially thought." As the sun set behind the perfectly manicured hedges of Willow Creek Estates, Karen realized that her reign of HOA terror might be coming to an end. But something in Margaret's tone suggested this was only the beginning of her troubles.